And perhaps I can make a few examples about each ideology and what they might see and what they might not see so clearly. Because in each of these ideologies, a lot of the time, people are stuck in fight or flight, and they see what they value, what they see as important, and what they're conditioned to see and what they're conditioned to not see. Because there's blind spots. Inevitably, each of these positions are kind of dualistic. For example, conservatism, I suppose, I mean, Edmund Burke is very influential over the conservative movement. It's about kind of gradual adaptation to changes rather than holding back change, or at least not changing too quickly, so that there can be social cohesion, social stability, and so that the valuable norms and traditions of society, as they see it, will continue. And so we won't have social disruption and or economic disruption or problems in society due to throwing away the baby with the bathwater too quickly. So they will point to the importance of an economy that's functioning well. They also point out to not having tax too high, and that will damage the well-being of everyone. They will say that you need to go and get a job. That they will emphasize the individual sovereignty and agency and responsibility to go and be successful on your own right with your own merits. But they will treat you like you're morally or in some other way completely or lacking in worth in some sense if you struggle with that, no matter what. I'm generalizing. No matter what the actual circumstances are. Now, keep in mind, there's a lot of poverty, and someone in a poor community, they might have issues with the norms in a poor community might be such as undermine getting a job in a very ingrained psychological conditioned way. And there might be an attitude of blaming others and not. Basically, it might be, there are a lot of things that might hold someone back in a community like that. You know, lack of single parents, for example. There are less single parents in poor communities. It's a fact. That is very much holds people back. Often, you won't get a recognition of this from conservatism. Or if they do, they'll blame it all on the other side, right? They'll say, oh, it's the left, which is why there's so many single parents. So we need to beat the left so that we have single parent problems, so there won't be a poverty problem. And that's not really, helpful, I would say. Even if they've got a point to a certain extent, you know, there are valuable points that the other side has that they might be missing. And they might have a tough stance on crime, right? And it might help in certain issues, deal with violent crime in certain areas. But what happens when someone gets imprisoned for smoking dope, for example, right? They get imprisoned in it, and then they meet hardened criminals, and then they struggle to get a job afterwards, and they've got social connections with criminals, and then they go off and join a gang or something, or do worse things. That's an example of a potential blind spot for conservatism. And I'm being general here. And keep in mind the foundation I laid here at the beginning of this video about no side is like entirely right or wrong, and they've each got certain blind spots and certain valuable points. And you can't see that when you're in a fight or flight mentality. Not saying you are. And there's this idea of for the sake of law and order, like sometimes they might advocate repressing freedom. That's certainly something there. And then there's the drug war. That's an example. They might For example, there's a sort of witch hunt mentality when it comes to threats to tradition that are perceived. For example, there was a point where D&D or metal were perceived as like terrible blights to the. This is more traditional conservatism, which is than conservatism as a whole. But nevertheless, I'll mention it here. They'll treat these like, oh, these are terrible, terrible threats. Were like they're everywhere, right? That like there was a time where communism was like, there's a communism around every single street corner, and you need to watch out for the communists, right? So, but I will point out that the media and witch hunt sort of fear-based sort of mob mentality, this can happen with any ideology, and it has happened with the left as well. And identity politics is a clear example of that. Not to say identity politics is all bad or lacking any points that are valuable, because I've come to learn that there is something valuable about not so much cancel culture, but there are certain values that are worthy and certain things where there's care there and there's a concern for the vulnerable. It's just the fight or flight mentality of anger and other emotions can distort this into something that isn't constructive and creates more divides. Just as a concern in conservatives, for example, for those who, about the effects of drugs and how they can ruin people's lives, or at least people can ruin their lives while taking them, and or how much high tax can harm the economy, for example, or the less people appreciating tradition less and just having no higher moral compass or no compass because and being maybe a bit nihilistic because I've got nothing they no higher purpose. And I'm generalizing again, like it's the same thing there. There might be a valuable point there, but because when you're in fight or flight and in an ideological egoic mindset, and an ideological mindset is fundamentally collective ego. Perhaps you could say collective unconscious as well. But is there really a difference there? Because a lot of this egoic stuff going on in the mind is to do with in the internal the mind, often subconsciously, there's a lot of unresolved things, right? So on one hand, it's the ego in a conscious way, but on the other hand, it's the ego in a subconscious way. And I'm not going to divide that up like in Jungian psychology, because I'm not going to get too much into that right now. But in any case, so I've made some references to the blind spots of conservatism, and a little bit of the left. And I could go into more when it comes to conservatism, but I don't need to go in the ins and outs of all of it. I'm sure you get the point. When it comes to the left, okay, so let's go into identity politics a bit more. It's a very this will be interesting, right? Because it's so divisive, isn't it? No matter what side you take, if you take a side on it, it's like there are people who you'll see is like this terrible threat, and they'll see you as a terrible threat. I understand why so many people in the spiritual community don't really talk about this, because it's contentious, isn't it? and it's sticky, and it's understandable. People might say, I'll just meditate and don't get caught up in politics. And yeah, I mean, there's something to that. Nevertheless, I feel like it's important to talk about this because I feel like there is a loving, compassionate, bridging divides approach that unifies and brings us together, that increasingly, as we move into the new earth, will be valuable and transformative. And I feel like, at least if we talk about this in a helpful, constructive, unifying way, that those who are ready to be receptive to that, even if they're just on the fence, or just if it will leave the seeds of an opening up, it will be helpful. That's where I'm coming from with this. So when it comes to identity politics, I'm not gonna, I could talk more about the neo-reactionary identity politics later. But when it comes to identity politics on the left, there's this, let's talk about the root of what's valuable behind that. And then we can address how it has become distorted. So there's a recognition that there are certain people in certain groups, whether it's economic, relating to poverty, or relating to discrimination, or whether it's racial or sexuality or gender, or any way in which someone might have difficulty growing up and living, that there's something that we need to show compassion and care for and recognition for that, and recognize ways in which we are fortunate and they are potentially unfortunate, but not in the sense of, and I don't mean this specifically into, how will I say this? Yeah, that they're unfortunate, and that we can recognize and be grateful for how we are fortunate. For example, like compared to most of history, even the average person in material terms has far better healthcare, far better access to food, and I'm not sure what quality of the food is, but far better access to food. And we're fortunate in many ways. We've got all this technology. In many ways, we're immensely fortunate, and we are richer than Henry VIII, even if we're, if we're poor. I'm not sure if, maybe not if we're homeless, but so in many ways we're fortunate. And there are difficulties that for a long time, women didn't have much freedom at all. Now, that's not to say they didn't have power, or a sort of soft power, so to speak, over or compared to men, over the household and being able to spread gossip or something. And there have been powerful women throughout history, but in many ways, women weren't, there was a suppression of the feminine, right? Sometimes even by the feminine. Female circumcision is an example of that, because often women will do it to other women, right? It's to do with the mind and what people believe. It's not something like, oh, men did it to women. It's not as simple as that. It relates to the wounded masculine and the wounded feminine, which I've gone into before, and I will go into more another time. So, but then on the other hand, men often went to war and died in terrible ways. Women had to bear the burden of that grief. So, it's a complicated situation. But yeah, we can recognize that women were treated poorly for a long time, and that in some places like the Middle East, for example, or not exclusively there, they're treated terribly to this day. And we can recognize that even in our current society, there's still rape, there's still cases of prejudice and discrimination, right? I'm not talking about the extent, just that it exists, right? We can recognize that. We can have empathy for those who suffer in that regard. And the same comes to issues related to homophobia, or maybe discrimination against those who are handicapped in some way, and so forth. I think you catch my drift. For every single group in which you can recognize that they're unfortunate, it's relevant here. And you can be grateful for how you are fortunate relative to them, and you can discuss ways in which you can help them. And they've got a concern about ways in which we can help them. But then there's this is where it starts to get distorted, you see, because there's a fight or flight mentality. They view these groups as vulnerable from the right, vulnerable from the bigots, vulnerable from the ways in which we're conditioned. They perceive us as fundamentally conditioned to persecute those groups. And they believe that if we don't recognize that we're conditioned to persecute them, that we're much more likely to persecute them. And if we recognize that we're inclined that way, we can start deconditioning ourselves from that and recondition ourselves to treat them better. And social conditioning is a thing. And I certainly would agree with the idea that people conditioning has social conditioning. The way the ego works on a collective level means that if you do another part of your group as a threat, or if you don't empathize them, you're in fight or flight about it, you might not treat them so well. I've recognized that myself in this very episode. That said, the distortion comes where instead of understanding, for example, this is contentious, but I'll do it. Suppose you learn about, suppose a woman learns about how women have been treated historically. They're living in the West, they learn about it, and they hear about examples of bad things happening to women in the West now. Okay, and they're told that women are systematically oppressed by a patriarchy that's ingrained into and conditioned into our very minds in our society. And this patriarchy affects our minds on a fundamental level, and that we don't even notice it, and that our language and the way we think. Now, I'm not saying I believe this. I actually don't believe that, or at least I don't believe in that ideology, but social conditioning has certainly, patriarchal norms have certainly existed. I think they're breaking down. Liberalism, liberal norms, not the liberal ideology, but liberal norms, social changes, energetic changes as we move towards and into the age of Aquarius. Increasingly, this is breaking down, and new ways of doing things are coming to the fore, and the wounded feminine is healing, and the wounded masculine is healing, and things are getting better. Honestly, they don't see it that way. They're in fight or flight. They're afraid. They feel like there's this impending threat to women, right? And that it hasn't really gone away, and that talking about it as if it's gone is a threat to dealing with it. And that the traditionalists, the traditional conservatives, and conservatives in general are a threat because they'll bring it back if we don't stop them. That's the idea. Or that we were, when it's pointed out, let's say in the gaming community, if you point out examples where there's creepiness towards women in that community sometimes. For example, or lots of portrayals of sexual things in games, for example, or movies, right? And sexual portrayal of women that doesn't focus at all on the actual characteristics of the personhood, that the person they are, right? On their humanity, but on personality, but entirely on that. And there are lots of people who are entirely focused on that aspect of things. They're not aware of the chakras and chakra blockages in the orange ray, which can cause hyper focus on the sexual without concern about personality and so forth, or shame regarding sex from the conservatives that you might associate with so conservatives. Now that's fine. There's not anything wrong with them for not understanding that. That's just that they're at where they are. They're in a fight or flight mentality, and most people don't know about this, right? So they will hear about these things, be told about these things by others, and honestly, they'll get into an ideology which conditions them into belief systems and a set of premises and conclusions that all fit together, where even if someone were to criticize a certain position, and even if they were to doubt a certain position about the radical feminist beliefs, that they would there'd be something else backing that up, and they would fall back onto that. And it's the idea that you can logically refute a radical feminist or someone of any ideology and systematically go through every single point and keep them engaged and listening and able to go along with it without emotionally reacting to the point of not going along with it and accept what you're saying and just like logically go through every single thing until they fundamentally have broken down their whole belief system and then build up a whole new one that's your ideology, which by the way is kind of really not ethical to do that, in my opinion. Even if you could, which is a fantasy that if you're trying to convert someone to your ideology that you might have, like people believe things, it's fundamentally to do with emotion, and you can't just like left brain logic your way to convincing them. It's not even about that. It's about love and acceptance, and that if you love and accept them, you might facilitate them loving, accepting you or others, and aid them in healing to the point where they can see a broader perspective and empathize with the other side and see where they're coming from. And that way, everyone involved will get, they will get a better, more clearer understanding of things and what they're missing and what they're not seeing. But you will also have your blind spots clarified and see things clearer, and there'll be a more holistic view that's more than you might learn from them just as much as they learn from you. But if you're in a conflict, you're not going to learn from each other. You're just going to hold each other back and get in this polarized fight over it. And it's just, well, we see how much suffering comes from that. Luckily, we're in a time of ascension where these things start to come up and there's opportunity for us to transcend them. And with this example of feminism, so this feminist, they will suppose that they've got their ideology that they conditioned themselves or are conditioned into, probably a bit of both. They've got this threat that they view conservatives as a threat. They might view men as a threat. They might view women anyone who doesn't believe in it. They might value women who don't get a job and who might be a housewife as a threat. They might view all religion as a threat. I mean, this is just examples, right? They might, want to talk about in any medium or media, films, games, whatever, how there's loads of sexism everywhere, and you've got to point it all out, which I am referencing something there. Not to denigrate anyone, just saying. and they might get in a lot of arguments, right? And they might go with a lot of suffering, just like, and then, but the thing is, there are anti-feminists who, well, this is just a term, these are just labels. Keep that in mind. Everything I'm talking about, just labels. I should have mentioned that in the beginning, actually. Yeah, there are people, so for example, MGTOW or men's rights activists or I mean, there's that Reigns of Kings thing, which is really toxic, I suppose, which is a judgment. But yeah, I'm not going into that right now. But basically, there's a perception that men are under threat from women, that women are gold digging, deceiving them throughout history, that men have been deceived or something. This is really a greed perspective. People who have had bad experiences with women and focusing on basically what I would say is the wounded feminine or underdeveloped feminine or femme fatales or the worst cases with women, right? And focusing on that as that's what women are, when it's not true. That's what happens with feminism. They focus on men. They just, to them, they call it toxic masculinity, right? They aren't necessarily inherently saying that masculinity is inherently, there's all this negative stuff. But what they're saying is all the rape and sexism and exploiting women in all these different ways, whatever, they're saying that with the social conditioning in our society, in this patriarchy, that's what masculinity is now, and that we need to change what masculinity is and recondition men and women such that masculinity and femininity take a situation, a role where men no longer exploit women and women aren't threatened by men. That's the whole mentality. This is just an example. Now, you could use it with any identity politics, right? God, I'm kind of going a bit on, taking a while on this, but that's okay. That's okay. So yeah, they'll be getting to, they might go to protest. They might have big arguments with men's rights activists or something, you know, and they might suffer for a long time. And if they've had negative experiences with men, that will be understandable. But the thing is, instead of a situation where if someone isn't in feminism and supposedly just meditating, right? A woman meditates, right? They get into Buddhism, right? Instead of into feminism. And I'm not saying it's wrong to be a feminist or it's right to be a Buddhist or anything. I'm just saying, just an example, they do the inner work, they clear up what's going on within. Because this woman in this case, at least so far in this story, isn't doing the inner work. They're seeing everything as an external threat and they're feeling threatened, right? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with this person. This is someone's at a certain level of energy and certain level of frequencies, and they're in a certain mental state. I don't intend any judgment here. And if any judgment that has come through or does come through in this, that's my ego, because I'm not like the super enlightened guru, right? I'm in a gradual process of opening my heart just as much as anyone else in the New Age community is. Our spiritual community, whatever. So, how's it going with this? So, if they meditate, do all the inner work, do lots of inner work, and so forth, all that suffering could be, they wouldn't be suffering like that. But that's not to say that it's wrong and a big mistake that they get into feminism. No, it's just a reflection of their state of mind as it is now, right? As with any ideology, when someone's in a fight or flight mentality, no ideology is worse than another, or it's not even wrong, because it might be part of their journey, right? They might experience all that, and it might be part of them experiencing what they don't want. They might grow through that experience and then actually learn a lot. They might learn a lot about the other side, and eventually something will click, and then they might actually reflect on that and use that for their spiritual growth. You know, I'm not saying it's wrong, or that someone getting into libertarianism or communism or fascism or whatever, and I know that's contentious for me to say that, but someone might become a fascist and then later become like really loving and accepting and with Buddhism and something, like they might transcend that. It's just a stage of where they're at currently, right? Anyone. So that's an example with identity politics. But so one thing to take out of this is what they write about, or at least what they. So here's the thing with privilege, right? Are certain people privileged, right? If you're, say someone's like, oh, let's just take me. I grew up in a well-off background and I'm a man, right? And I'm white. Okay, I'm not. So I'm grateful for how I've benefited from certain things. Now, at the same time, I've got certain medical problems, and I could, if I was so inclined, say that other people who don't have those health problems are privileged compared to me, and that they need to check their privilege and be ashamed of not recognizing that, or ashamed by the fact that they don't have those problems and that they had it easy, unlike me, right? That wouldn't be helpful, would it? I don't think so. And I'm not going to be ashamed of being a man or what have you, right? But I don't intend on being affronted by someone telling me that I do need to take my privilege or something. And I might do, and that would be a reflection of me more in a work I need to do, or I don't need to do, but I could do, It would be a reflection of my state of mind. But gratitude is a powerful and transformative emotion for raising your frequency and opening your heart, right? Now, you could use a recognition of being privileged in some sense as an opportunity for being grateful, or you could feel ashamed for all the ways in which men have hurt women throughout history, and view yourself and identify with being a persecutor and fundamentally, collectively in the oppressor bad guy group, and needing to atone for all the collective sins of men throughout history, and decondition your mind to the hatred that you no doubt have towards women, even if you don't perceive it. You know what I mean? Like, you could beat yourself up over it, right? Or you could feel grateful, and through that you'd actually get more compassion to women and yourself, right? That's just an example, right? And keep in mind that what I said about identity politics with the example of feminism, it as much applies to anything, right? So suppose you get something who's a near reaction. So first of all, suppose they come across the idea, okay, they just simply believe, okay, it's a fact that there are different races. That's what they think, right? And maybe they're reacting against the idea that we need to be ashamed for being white or something. And they go to the opposite extreme. And they're like, no, I need to be proud of it, right? That's where it starts, potentially. Because if they had an open heart, they might not be responding in the sense of like, okay, that they're threatened by certain threats, and then they need to assert their strength and deal with the threats to them, the threats to their whiteness or their identity as someone who's white. Because if you identify as someone as white and you see people saying all these things about white people, and you identify as a white person, because identity is key here, keep in mind, you identify as something, any criticism of that thing is an attack to you, right? If you identify as a woman, if you see a women's rights activist and he criticizes women in some way, or a woman in a situation, you're like, oh, I'm attacked, right? If you identify as someone who values liberty, and someone's like, we need to deal with this crisis by doing this, this, and this, and even if you does take away liberty, it's more important that we keep people safe. You'll be like, oh, I'm so offended by that, I'm threatened. with any example, with any ideology, there's certain things you identify with, and it's almost like that's part of you in terms of, or you're under the illusion that it's part of you. Just as much that your possessions, if you were to lose a possession or it breaks, you would feel hurt like it's part of you. Because you're almost identifying with that as yours, right? And your beliefs and your identity is like it's yours. It's not really, but it's like it's yours, and that you're threatened by in some way. And so your basic instincts or fight or flight, like there's a lion attacking you, are playing in. When your values and beliefs and identity is being threatened by someone criticizing what you believe or criticizing what you identify as, right? I feel like if I spelled that out early on, if I said that early on, that might have clarified things. So anyway, with the case of neo-reactionaries, it starts off perhaps with they identifying as white. And that in itself is actually fine or innocuous at first, right? And they might look at history, they might look at the Renaissance, they might look at kings, and they might feel a sense of pride as kings in Europe. And a sense of pride where they look at Europe, they look at colonialism, and they're like, wow, we were really successful. Aren't we such... Oh God, I have to be careful. People take things out of context, can't they? Oh, geez. They might look at that and feel proud of it and feel their sense of worth will increase by identifying with being white, and they will feel by being collectively part of that they are, and if they're insecure, that might help them. They might feel less insecure by doing that, or at least, I'm not saying it's healthy. I'm saying they might, and it's the same dynamic as with feminism or any identity politics or any identity or political ideology, right? They will feel like they might feel puffed up with pride and like worth, and that they're part of something, a cause of white people through history. Whew. Anyway, the next step is identifying threats to the white race. That's what they'll do, right? Now, it might start off with the left criticizing white people and identity politics, all that left identity politics. They'll see that as a threat, right? But what would be the next step? Well, they would focus on differences in, now I've seen these people say this stuff, right? They'll focus on the differences in crime statistics between whites and blacks, but they wouldn't necessarily, because they're in a fight or flight ideological mindset, look at it in a nuanced way. Look at the poverty in some poor communities, in black communities in America, the ghettoization effect, and how, or in certain issues of subculture that rap might facilitate, and how, I'm generalizing, and how that might hold people back in such a community. And or they might not recognize, those sort of honestly, I think personally the black community has, how do I say this, ancestral trauma from slavery, and I think that causes certain problems that that a white identitarian might attribute to as inherent characteristics of someone being black. And that's the next step, right, for them. That would be the trouble, because it starts, because then in fight or flight mentality, and they feel threatened by these different things, but at the same time proud of their group, and then what they identify with, they'll identify threats to their group, and they'll identify things to be proud of relating to their group. It's the same with any ideology and group, right? People who are feminists, they will be proud of the accomplishments of feminism and overcoming and defeating oppressive white males, right? Whatever. Just give me an example. So, yeah, the next step, they'll be look at those crime statistics and say, well, doesn't this show that, oh, I need to be careful. Okay, so they would look at that and see that as why they would think that it's important to separate, so that, because they would perceive white people as being endangered by what they would see as a tendency towards crime and violence, because they look at the statistics, but because they've got a distorted perspective, they attribute it to inherent characteristics, and they might overemphasize those statistics. The next stage is they might look at, now I'm a conspiracy theorist. I do believe there's the cabal or the Illuminati and that they influence things, right? I've taken a step out of going into the rabbit hole on that, but I recognize that everything is part of the divine plan, right? So, and we're being tested by the actual conspiracies that are happening, and that it's actually part of the divine plan how we wake up, because we need to confront certain negative things through catalyst. But so there are issues with that haven't been addressed yet, like to do with, there's lobbying, there's big banking, big banks too big to fail, there's big business influencing things, and there's certain figures who claim to be helping those in need while actually influencing things towards certain agendas that they might have. That happens a lot there are certain elites, so to speak, they're not really elite, but who have certain vested interests that might be service to self in nature, or not in the best interest of the liberty of the people, and might be controlling and deceptive, right? Now, a white identitarian might identify that, they might notice that, right? And they might notice the wealth. Okay, they might notice that, I've got to be very careful with this, could be misconstrued, but no, I have faith it won't be. If it is, I'll be fine. They might look at that, and what they might see, there's a tendency for big business and wealthy elites manipulating things, right? And they might perceive subjectively, erroneously in my opinion, because they won't be seeing the bigger picture, and they'll be threatened. They'll be threatened by this manipulation they perceive from elites and conspiracies happening. Perhaps understandably, right? I mean, Illuminati, those who believe in the Illuminati are threatened in that sense. Unless, of course, they let go of their fear on it. But what happens is that a white identitarian will see a certain ethnic group as disproportionately owning wealth and being more frequent among those elites, right? And so they might identify that ethnic group as the cause of the deception. And then they might feel threatened and identify that ethnic group as a threat. And then you see how insidious ideology can be. And it's not just this ideology is the bad one. Like, all ideologies can be just as prone to dehumanization and the horrors that can come from it as neo-reactionaries. Neo-reactionaries are just the most clear example because of key events in the 20th century, such as World War II. You know what I'm talking about, don't you? And so, yeah, and they will look at certain historical events of like, no, that didn't happen. It happened differently. So they'll get their own entirely different version of events where what they identify with is they're the good guys and they're threatened by these other ethnic groups that are the challenges to their ethnic group and the threat to their ethnic group, which they identify in. whether it's communism or certain ethnicities, they will view those as threats. And then they might actually call, there might be cases of people in the community causing harm based on anger and intent, to, or hatred that might come from that, to, for the sake of their race. Now, what I've attempted to spell out here with identity politics, whether it's on the left or the right, and different ideologies, it happens to, for example, libertarianism. I mean, like, you might get someone do violence against those they perceive as statists in the name of liberty. And then, you know, I'm not saying that they do, I'm just saying that's conceivable because of perceiving threats to what they identify as with, and so forth. And with political parties, you just get this dynamic. You can get it at football clubs, right? It used to be worse, but you get the, you know, football supporters beating each other up or something. You used to get it in the 60s in the UK. I mean, you get it we got it in Rwanda when it comes to which tribe you are, and it's the same thing as what happened in Rwanda or Yugoslavia, and what should I say? Wait, what was Yugoslavia? And this whole dynamic that I've been talking about, it plays this fight or flight mentality. This whole dynamic, it plays out with every single group. But luckily, if we can look at this if we can accept, other groups, or these groups are ultimately labels and arbitrary, the boundaries between them are illusions anyway. But if we can accept someone else who has different values or different beliefs from us, if we accept at the very least that they perceive it that way, because if you don't accept it, you're like trying to control the situation by trying to change it. You can accept that the fact that people have certain views, right? Or that certain other people exist. You can look at history and look at certain events that have transpired and how certain people have been, certain groups or certain people have been affected. You can accept that. If you can accept, for example, how women have been treated, and I don't mean say it's good, just accept that historically that has occurred. It's a fact that it's occurred, right? If you can accept it and not be like, oh God, it's such a problem, we've got to change it, or oh, I'm so afraid of that, or I'm so ashamed of that, whatever. If you can accept it, that literally, there's been research done that there's a certain part of your brain, I think it's the it's part on the front of our head, I can't remember. It's not neocortex, is it? Maybe? Frontal lobe? Something to do with that. Acceptance actually activates that part of the brain more. And that's a more recently evolved part of our brain, which is, I don't think that's, and that might be associated with our actual spiritual evolution over time as well. And I don't think that's a coincidence. But at the very least, it's a meaningful coincidence, which Carl Jung called synchronicity. But in any case, neurologically and spiritually and psychologically, or from those, in a way that is all of those things, when we accept the other groups, the other side, so to speak, and other people and ourselves, it opens up we're not blocking wisdom from coming in from others. We're not blocking the ability to take in and understand what other people are saying when they share their experiences. There's an example of and so we can get greater understanding. There's an example of there was a woman who was a radical feminist. She had a lot of resentment towards men. And she was doing research about sexism, I think. But the paper she was doing was about male attitudes towards women and experiences with women, I think, if I remember. And what she did is she was doing the study, and as men were sharing their experiences with women, she was interpreting with her own bias, okay, they're saying that because they hate women in this way, or they're biased in this way, they say in which they might, oh, that's their privilege and they're not recognizing it or whatever. So what the men were sharing, she was interpreting in a resentful way that was distorted and not loving and compassionate. Because she thought it had an ideology. Not that feminism is a particular problem. All ideologies are like that, as I've said a whole number of times, ad nauseum. So then, what they were sharing, gradually, it created this cognitive dissonance, because she had to come to terms with the fact that she expressed this, that basically she started to empathize with them involuntarily, and she had to question her beliefs, and had like a crisis of faith, I suppose, or crisis of belief, or a sort of crisis where it was very difficult for her, because she had to confront all the way in her mind she was treating them or viewing them, right? Men, and that allowed her to let go of her ideology and see things in a more holistic perspective. That said, in this particular case, I think, from what I recall, she ended up taking the opposite side and being anti-feminism. I'm not sure. And then I don't know, but she might have ended up being just as ideological against feminism afterwards, which is something that can happen because it's dualistic. And I don't know, that might not be the case, but there was an opportunity there in any case, if you come out of an ideology, to open up and gain a more holistic understanding. And at least for a period, from what I know, she did get a greater understanding of the other side by accepting and empathizing with them. That's the point. And another point is that even if you come out of an ideology, you can resent how you were when you're in that ideology and go to the other one and go like, oh, right, this is a solution then. And duality, one extreme to the other, doesn't really help. But duality, of course, is innate. The ego is dualistic. It's black and white, right? And on a collective level, in ideology and belief systems and religion and solutions to a crisis, it's the same way. So yeah, and from that understanding of other people, it allows empathy, or greater empathy and sympathy. And through this gradually opens our heart and our heart chakra and lets in the light, let's say the divine light, of wisdom and love. And from that, we can care more for each other and identify as one with humanity. Right? And what happens? What would happen if everyone on Earth experienced this opening up of the heart fully? Of identifying as a whole and fully empathizing with every other human, or non-human, or animal, or extraterrestrial, or whatever, right? Or even rock. If everyone was in unconditional love and acceptance and joy and understanding each other and synced up with each other on a collective conscious and collective unconscious level, then if everyone healed from the wounds inside, cleared up the mess inside, doing the inner work, doing the shadow work, well, that is the ascension process. And it's how we all bridge the divides and come together as one. It's how we go from ideology to unity, from ego to love, right? And it's so great to be doing this. Oh man. Yeah, I love doing this. Oh man. Sorry, I just got emotional with that. Yeah. I'm glad I did this. I tried before and I kind of got stuck up into details and it didn't really work out. But this time, yeah, I'm happy with what I discussed here. And there's other ideologies that I discuss, what they see, what they don't see. I know I've dealt with certain contentious issues. Hopefully I've managed to deal with it address it in a holistic, loving way or unified way. Any ideology or belief system you can think of, you can look at how there's the threat to it that they perceive, what they identify with. Everything I've been talking about applies to any ideology or belief system, right? It's the same dynamic. It's just a different story. Every ideology is the same, but coated in a different paint or wearing different clothes, you know? Every soul, okay, we're all unique souls, right? We've had different lives, different soul journey, but right at our core, at the soul level, we're all one, right? And we have different lives, we wear different bodies and with different personalities. Maybe we've got a few soul personality inclinations that appear in multiple lifetimes or many lifetimes, you know. We're all the creator, but we're all a part of the creator, a unique part of the creator, and yet the creator nonetheless. As to how much we experience of that and how much we can create and what kind of experience we have, whether it's loving, hateful, suffering, joy, that's on us, right? And that's our choice and our path and our awareness and our consciousness and our frequency, right? I have confidence that all these ideological divides inevitably are broken down and people are opening their hearts to love, and that it's already on an energetic level, it's already inevitable. Perhaps we could accelerate the process by doing our own work and authentically expressing the message of communicating unity and bridging divides and a holistic, empathetic understanding that bridge divides, like which I am at the very least intending here. So, you know, if you enjoyed this, feel free to like or subscribe. If you've got any suggestions about anything I've missed or any way in which I can improve, anything you'd like me to talk about, you know, in more detail or granularity or what have you, go ahead and comment, you know. So I leave you in love and peace or something. I don't know. That's just something in the law of one, you know, that Ra says at the end of it. That sprung to mind. I like it. Or you could say, without further ado, have a great day or a lovely evening or both. And bye for now.